The woman behind the counter didn't look up when she said it. "That one bites strangers." Her voice was flat, rehearsed, like she'd said it 100 times before. I stood there in front of the kennel, my hand halfway to the chain link, and I could feel the weight of those words settling between us. The dog, a German shepherd mix with scars along his muzzle and one ear that didn't stand quite right, stared at me from the back corner of his concrete cell. His eyes were amber, old, and I recognized something in them I'd seen in my own reflection for 30 years. The shelter smelled like bleach and fear and something else I couldn't name, something that reminded me of forward operating bases and waiting. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. "He came from a bad situation," she continued, still not meeting my eyes. "We can show you some other dogs, friendlier ones." But I wasn't looking at her anymore. I was looking at him, and he was looking at me, and neither of us was moving. "Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. I'm 63 years old now, and my hands shake when it rains. Not all the time, just when the drops hit metal, when they make that particular sound against the roof of my truck or the gutter outside my window. It's been 4 decades since Khe Sanh. Since I came back from Vietnam with a Bronze Star, they pinned to my chest in a ceremony where half the faces in the crowd looked through me like I was made of smoke. I live alone in a small house outside Fayetteville, North Carolina, close enough to Fort Bragg that I can still hear the artillery drills on clear nights. The neighborhood is mixed. Some retired military, some young families, some folks who've been here since before the base expanded. I keep to myself mostly. I work part-time at the hardware store on Bragg Boulevard, helping folks find the right screws or explaining the difference between deck stain and exterior paint. It's quiet work. No one asks questions. No one needs to know that some nights I wake up at 0300 with my heart pounding, convinced I can hear movement in the wire. The Veterans Affairs sends me letters sometimes asking if I need counseling, if I'm adjusting well. I throw most of them away. I'd been thinking about getting a dog for months before I finally drove to the shelter that Tuesday afternoon. The house was too quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet. The kind that amplifies every thought you'd rather not have. Every memory that wants to surface when your guard is down. I'd had a dog once, years ago, before my ex-wife took everything that wasn't nailed down, and some things that were. A beagle named Buck, who'd sleep at the foot of the bed and follow me from room to room like he was afraid I'd disappear if he lost sight of me. He died while I was on my second tour, and I never got another one. Never felt right, bringing something innocent into the mess I was carrying. But lately the silence had teeth. So I drove to the Cumberland County Animal Shelter on Sycamore Dairy Road, past the fast food places and the payday loan shops and the churches with signs promising salvation in 3 easy steps. The parking lot was half empty. Inside, it smelled like industrial cleaner trying to mask something organic and desperate. The woman at the front desk was young, maybe 25, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail and a smile that didn't reach her eyes when she looked at me. "Can I help you?" she asked, and there was something in her tone, not quite suspicion, but a kind of wary distance, like she was already deciding what kind of person I was before I opened my mouth. I told her I was looking to adopt a dog. Something medium-sized, maybe, good with being alone during the day while I was at work. She nodded, pulled out a clipboard with a form attached, and slid it across the counter. "You'll need to fill this out first," she said. "Then I can show you who's available." I filled out the form, name, address, employment, previous pet experience, and handed it back. She glanced at it, and I saw her eyes catch on something. My address, maybe, or my age, or the fact that I lived alone? People make calculations like that, quick and quiet, and you learn to see it happening even when they think they're being subtle. She led me back through a metal door into the kennel area, and the noise hit me like a wave. Barking, whining, the scrape of claws on concrete, the metallic rattle of gates. Rows of chain-link cages lined both walls, each one holding a dog in some stage of desperation or resignation. Some jumped and spun when we walked past, tails wagging so hard their whole bodies curved. Others just watched, silent, like they'd already given up on the idea that anyone would choose them. That's when I saw him. He was in the last kennel on the left, sitting perfectly still in the back corner with his tail curled around his legs. The shelter worker, her name tag said Jennifer, stopped in front of his cage and sighed. "This is Duke," she said, and even the way she said his name sounded tired. "He's been here 4 months. German Shepherd mix, about 7 years old, we think. Came in as a cruelty case. Owner kept him chained in a yard with no shelter, barely fed him. Neighbors finally called it in." She crossed her arms. "He's not aggressive exactly, but he doesn't trust people. Won't let anyone touch him. Bit one of our volunteers when she tried to leash him for a walk." I moved closer to the kennel, and Duke's eyes tracked me, but his body didn't shift. There were scars on his muzzle, pale lines through the dark fur, and his ribs showed just slightly under his coat. One of his ears stood up straight, but the other flopped forward like it had been broken and healed wrong. "We've been trying to socialize him," Jennifer continued. "But honestly, he's probably not adoptable. We're running out of space, and dogs like him, well, they don't usually get a happy ending." She said it matter-of-factly, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized. I knew what she meant. I'd seen that look before. The look of someone who'd been written off, deemed too damaged, too difficult, not worth the effort of saving. I'd seen it in the mirror enough times. I knelt down in front of the kennel, slowly, keeping my movements small and deliberate. Duke's ears twitched, but he didn't move. I could hear Jennifer shift her weight behind me, could feel her impatience radiating like heat. "Sir, maybe we should look at some of the other dogs," she said. "We have a really sweet lab mix in Kennel 12, great with kids, loves everybody." "I want to meet this one," I said quietly, not looking away from Duke. There was a long pause. "He bites strangers," she said again, and this time there was something sharper in her voice, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "I really don't think that's a good idea." I stood up and turned to face her. She took a half step back, and I saw it, that flicker in her eyes, that instant recalibration of threat assessment. I'd seen it 1,000 times. In grocery stores when I reached for something on a high shelf. In banks when I tried to cash a check. In VA waiting rooms when I asked too many questions about my benefits. The math people do in their heads when they look at a 63-year-old black man and decide, consciously or not, what he might be capable of. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level, "I've been around dogs my whole life. I know how to read them. I'd just like to sit with him for a minute, if that's allowed." She hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "I'll need to get the shelter manager to supervise," she said, already turning away. "Stay here." She disappeared through a door marked "Staff Only," and I was alone with the sound of dogs and my own breathing. The shelter manager was a man in his 40s with a gut that hung over his belt and a handshake that lasted a half-second too short. His name was Rick, and he looked me up and down like he was measuring me for a coffin. "Jennifer says you want to meet Duke," he said, pronouncing each word carefully, like he was talking to someone who might not understand English. "I have to tell you, sir, that dog is not safe for adoption. He's got behavioral issues we haven't been able to resolve." I nodded. "I understand. I'd still like to try." Rick exhaled through his nose, a sound that was half sigh, half snort. "Fine. But you sign a waiver, and if he goes for you, don't say I didn't warn you." He produced a clipboard with a form that basically said I wouldn't sue if Duke tore my throat out, and I signed it without reading the fine print. Then he unlocked Duke's kennel, not opening the door, just standing there with the key in the lock like he was ready to slam it shut at the first sign of trouble. "Go ahead," he said, But keep your movements slow, and if he shows teeth, you back out immediately. I stepped into the kennel, and the door clanged shut behind me. The space was maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. Concrete floor, concrete walls, a metal water bowl in one corner, and a rubber mat in the other. It smelled like bleach and old urine, and something else underneath. Something animal and afraid. Duke hadn't moved. He was still sitting in the back corner, watching me with those amber eyes, his body coiled tight, like a spring. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his ears were half back, not quite aggressive, but definitely not relaxed. I didn't move toward him. Instead, I sat down on the concrete floor about 3 feet from the door, cross-legged, and let my hands rest in my lap. My knees protested. Arthritis had been setting in for years, a souvenir from too many nights sleeping on cold ground in the jungle, but I ignored it. I kept my eyes on Duke but didn't stare directly at him. Staring is a challenge in dog language, and I wasn't here to challenge him. Outside the kennel, I could hear Rick shift his weight, could feel his impatience like static in the air. A minute passed. Then 2. Duke's ear twitched. His nose moved slightly, testing the air. I stayed still, breathing slowly, letting him come to his own conclusions. And then, without really meaning to, I felt it rising in my chest. That familiar tightness, that pressure behind my eyes that I'd spent 40 years learning to suppress. It started as a memory. The face of a kid I'd known in country, a private from Detroit named Marcus, who'd stepped on a mine 3 days before his tour was up. The sound it made. The way the medic looked at me afterward, shaking his head, and I knew Marcus wasn't going to make it home. It spread from there, blooming into all the other memories I kept locked down. The faces of men who didn't come back, the weight of my rifle in the rain, the way my mother looked at me when I came home with a medal and a hollow stare, like I was her son but also wasn't anymore. The way my wife looked at me, years later, when she said she couldn't do this anymore, couldn't live with someone who was always half somewhere else. The way the guys at the VFW turned away when I walked in, because I was the wrong kind of veteran, the wrong war, the wrong color. I tried to swallow it down, but it was too late. The first tear slid hot down my cheek, and then another, and suddenly I was crying in a dog kennel, in front of 2 strangers and a scarred German shepherd who'd been told his whole life that he was worthless. I didn't make a sound. That was the first thing they taught us. How to cry without sound. How to break down without breaking formation. My shoulders shook, and the tears came steady, but I didn't sob, didn't gasp. I just sat there on that cold concrete floor and let 40 years of held-back grief spill out through my eyes. I heard Rick mutter something outside the kennel, probably something about me being unstable, probably already regretting letting me in here. I didn't care. I was too far gone to care about what anyone thought. And then Duke moved. Not toward me, not yet. But his head tilted slightly and one ear came forward. His nose was working overtime now, reading the chemical signature of my tears. The hormones and pheromones that signal pain to anyone who knows how to read them. Dogs know pain. They're fluent in it, in a way humans pretend not to be. Another minute passed, and Duke stood up. My heart rate spiked. Some part of me still wired for threat assessment, still ready for the attack, but I didn't move, didn't tense. He took one step forward, then another, his movements careful and deliberate, like he was walking through a minefield. He stopped about 2 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the individual scars on his muzzle, the clouded edge of one eye that suggested old trauma. He sniffed the air between us, his whole body taut with uncertainty. I kept my hands in my lap, kept my breathing steady even though my vision was blurred with tears. Duke took another step, and now he was right in front of me, his scarred face level with mine. I could smell him, the shelter smell of antiseptic soap, but underneath it something warmer, something that reminded me of the farm dogs I'd grown up with in rural Georgia, back before the world got complicated. He extended his neck, slowly, cautiously, and touched his nose to my wet cheek. The touch was feather-light, barely there, but it sent a shock through my entire body. I still didn't move. Duke sniffed my face, my jaw, the salt trail of my tears, and then, so slowly I almost didn't realize it was happening, he lowered his head and rested it on my knee. The weight of it was solid and warm and real. His body relaxed incrementally, the tension bleeding out of his shoulders, and he let out a long, slow breath that I felt through my jeans. I lifted one hand, moving like I was defusing a bomb, and placed it gently on his head. His fur was coarse under my palm, and I could feel the ridge of an old scar tissue under my fingers. He didn't pull away. He didn't growl. He just stayed there, his head on my knee, his breathing gradually sinking with mine. Outside the kennel, there was absolute silence. Rick wasn't muttering anymore. Jennifer had appeared next to him, and I could see them both through the chain link, staring like they were watching something impossible. I didn't look at them. I kept my hand on Duke's head and my eyes on the concrete wall, and I let myself cry until there was nothing left to cry out. When the tears finally stopped, Duke lifted his head and looked at me. Not with suspicion anymore, with something else, something that looked almost like recognition, like he was seeing me the same way I'd seen him when I first walked up to his kennel. Another survivor, another casualty of circumstances beyond our control, still standing despite everything that had tried to break us. Rick opened the kennel door, and his face was different now, less certain, less dismissive. "Well," he said, and his voice had lost some of its earlier edge, "I've never seen him do that before." I stood up slowly, my knees cracking, and Duke stood with me, staying close to my left leg. Jennifer was staring at us like we'd performed a magic trick. "He doesn't even let us touch him," she said quietly. "We've had trainers try, behaviorists. No one could get near him." I looked down at Duke, and he looked up at me, and there was an understanding passing between us that didn't need words. "I'd like to adopt him," I said. Rick hesitated, and I could see him working through the bureaucratic calculations in his head. The liability, the paperwork, the fact that he'd just watched a dangerous dog choose to trust someone after 4 months of refusing human contact. Finally, he nodded. "I'll need you to fill out the adoption application," he said. "There's a 7-day waiting period, home visit, the usual process." "I understand. And you'll need to sign additional waivers, given his history." "That's fine." Rick studied me for a moment longer, and I could see the question forming behind his eyes. The one he wasn't quite sure how to ask. The one about why someone like me would want a dog like this when there were easier options available. But he didn't ask it. Maybe he knew the answer wouldn't make sense to someone who'd never needed saving themselves. They led us back to the front office, Duke walking close enough to my leg that I could feel the warmth of him through my jeans. The other dogs in their kennels watched us pass, some barking, some whining, all of them desperate for the same thing Duke had just found. A reason to believe that someone might choose them despite their damage. At the front desk, Jennifer handed me a stack of forms, and I started filling them out while Duke sat at my feet, his shoulder pressed against my calf. Rick disappeared into the back office and returned a few minutes later with a folder. "I pulled his file," he said, setting it on the counter. "You should know what you're getting into." I opened the folder and started reading. Duke had been seized from a property on the outskirts of town 6 months ago. The owner, a man with a long history of animal cruelty charges, had kept him chained to a tree with a logging chain. No shelter. Fed sporadically. When animal control showed up, Duke was underweight, dehydrated, covered in sores from the chain rubbing his neck raw. He'd bitten the animal control officer who tried to load him into the truck, not a serious bite, more of a warning, and had been labeled aggressive in the initial intake report. The shelter had worked with him for 2 months, trying to socialize him, but he'd remained distant, reactive, unwilling to trust. He'd bitten the volunteer, a young woman who'd moved too fast, reached too quickly, and after that, he'd been moved to the back kennel, the one reserved for dogs whose time was running out. He was scheduled for euthanasia next week, Rick said quietly, watching my face as I read. We just don't have the resources for dogs who can't be placed. I closed the folder and looked down at Duke. He was staring up at me with those amber eyes, and I wondered if he knew how close he'd come to the end. If dogs understood mortality the way humans do, if he'd been counting down his days the way I sometimes caught myself doing. The home visit happened 3 days later. A woman from the shelter, not Jennifer, someone older named Patricia, came to my house in the late afternoon, carrying a clipboard and wearing sensible shoes. She walked through my small 3-bedroom ranch-style home, checking the fencing in the backyard, asking questions about my schedule, my experience with dogs, my plans for training and veterinary care. I answered everything honestly. Yes, I lived alone. Yes, I worked part-time but was home most days. Yes, I had a fenced yard, chain link, 6 feet high, gate with a working latch. Yes, I understood that Duke had behavioral challenges and would need patience, possibly professional training. No, I didn't have small children or other pets. Patricia made notes on her clipboard, her expression neutral and professional. When we finished the interior walkthrough, she asked if we could sit at the kitchen table for a few final questions. I made coffee, the good stuff, not the instant, and we sat across from each other in the afternoon light, filtering through the window over the sink. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice careful, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't take offense." I nodded, waiting. "Duke is a difficult dog," she continued. "He's been through trauma, and he's going to require a lot of work. There are easier dogs at the shelter. Younger, friendlier, already trained. Dogs that would be happy to curl up on the couch and watch TV with you." She paused, studying my face. "Why Duke? What made you choose him specifically?" I took a sip of my coffee, buying time to organize the answer in my head. How do you explain to someone that you recognized yourself in the eyes of a broken dog? That you saw the same wariness, the same careful distance, the same expectation of being hurt that you'd been carrying for 40 years? "I guess," I said slowly, "because he reminded me of someone I used to know." Patricia waited, and I could tell she wanted me to elaborate, but I didn't. Some things don't translate well into words, and I'd learned a long time ago that most people don't really want to hear about Vietnam, about coming home to a country that didn't want you, about spending decades trying to figure out how to be normal when normal died in a jungle halfway around the world. She must have seen something in my face, because she nodded and made a note on her clipboard. "The shelter manager mentioned that Duke responded to you in a way he hasn't responded to anyone else," she said. "That counts for a lot. Sometimes animals know things about people that we don't know about ourselves." She stood up, gathering her papers. "I'm going to approve the adoption, Mr. Turner. You can pick him up tomorrow afternoon. We'll send you home with his medical records, some food to transition him to whatever brand you choose, and a list of recommended trainers in the area." I walked her to the door, and she paused on the front step. "He's going to test you," she said. "He's going to push boundaries, see if you'll give up on him like everyone else did. That's what trauma does. It makes you expect the worst so you're not surprised when it comes." "I know," I said. She smiled, a small, sad smile that suggested she knew more about trauma than her professional demeanor let on. "I think you do," she said. "Good luck, Mr. Turner. I hope it works out." I spent that evening preparing. I drove to the pet store on Yadkin Road and bought a heavy-duty leash, a collar that wouldn't chafe, 2 stainless steel bowls, a bag of high-quality dog food, a bed that looked sturdy enough for a working breed, and a collection of toys, rubber balls, rope pulls, a Kong that could be stuffed with treats. The cashier, a kid with acne and a name tag that said Tyler, rang everything up and asked if I was getting a puppy. "No," I said. An older dog. Cool, he said, like it didn't matter either way, and handed me my receipt. I picked Duke up at 1 o'clock the following afternoon. The shelter was busy, families looking at puppies, a couple arguing quietly about whether they had room for a second dog, a little girl pressing her face against the glass of the cat room. I signed the final paperwork, paid the adoption fee, and Rick brought Duke out on a leash. He looked different than he had in the kennel, more alert, his ears forward, his eyes scanning the lobby with cautious interest. When he saw me, his tail moved, not a full wag, just a slight flag motion, like he was testing whether it was safe to be happy. "He's all yours," Rick said, handing me the leash. There was something in his voice that might have been respect. "Good luck." I thanked him, and Duke and I walked out of the shelter together into the bright November afternoon. The parking lot smelled like rain and exhaust. Duke stopped at the curb, sniffing the air, his body tense with the overwhelming sensory input of the world outside the kennel. I gave him time, didn't pull on the leash, just stood there with him while he processed his new reality. When he was ready, we walked to my truck, a 20-year-old Ford F-150 with more rust than paint. I opened the passenger door, and Duke hesitated, looking up at me like he was asking permission. "Go ahead," I said quietly, and he jumped in, settling on the bench seat with his nose pointed toward the windshield. The drive home took 15 minutes. Duke sat perfectly still the entire time, watching the world slide past, strip malls and gas stations and churches and the long stretch of pine trees that lined Highway 87. I kept the radio off, letting him adjust to the sound of the engine, the movement of the truck, the fact that he was leaving the only place he'd known for 6 months. When we pulled into my driveway, Duke's ears pricked up. I parked in front of the garage and turned off the engine, and we sat there for a moment in the sudden quiet. "This is home now," I told him, and his ears swiveled toward my voice. "It's not much, but it's safe. No chains, no hunger. No one's going to hurt you here." He looked at me with those amber eyes, and I wanted to believe he understood, but I knew trust isn't built with words. It's built with time and consistency, and the slow, patient work of proving that the world isn't only cruel. I got out of the truck and opened his door. Duke jumped down, his paws hitting the gravel driveway, and immediately started sniffing. The tires, the ground, the corner of the garage where something had probably pissed a territory marker. I let him explore, following loosely at the end of the leash, giving him space to map his new environment. We walked around the house to the backyard. The fence was solid, the gate secure, and the yard was about a quarter acre of patchy grass and a few dogwoods that were losing their leaves. Duke moved systematically along the fence line, checking every corner, every post, his nose working overtime. When he finished his inspection, he looked back at me and I unclipped the leash. For a moment he just stood there, processing the fact that he was free. Then he took off running, not escaping, just running, his body stretching out in a full gallop across the grass, his ears flat against his head. He ran the perimeter once, twice, 3 times, burning off 6 months of kennel energy, and when he finally stopped, he was panting hard, his tongue lolling out, and if I didn't know better, I'd say he was smiling. The first week was careful. Duke and I moved around each other like diplomats from nations with a history of war, testing boundaries, learning each other's languages. He slept in the living room on the bed I'd bought him, positioned where he could see both the front door and the hallway to the bedrooms. He ate his food in the kitchen methodically, like he'd learned not to trust that there would be more tomorrow. He didn't beg, didn't jump, didn't demand attention. He just existed in my space with a kind of careful politeness that broke my heart a little more each day. I learned his tells. When his ears went back flat against his head, he needed space. When he pressed his shoulder against my leg, he wanted contact, but not overwhelming affection. When he stared at the front door with his body rigid, he was hearing something I couldn't, A car backfiring, a motorcycle, something that triggered a memory he couldn't explain. At night, he had nightmares. I'd wake to the sound of him whimpering in the dark, his legs twitching like he was running from something. I'd get up and sit on the floor next to his bed, my hand on his shoulder, and talk to him in the same low, steady voice I'd used on night watch in the jungle when the darkness felt like it had teeth. "It's okay, Duke. You're safe. I'm here. You're okay." Eventually, he'd settle. His breathing would even out, and I'd stay there until I was sure he was deep asleep again. Then I'd go back to my own bed and lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways the past never really lets go. We established routines. Morning walk at 0600 around the neighborhood. Duke staying close to my left leg like he'd been trained for heel work at some point in his previous life. Breakfast at 0700. I'd leave for work at the hardware store around 0830, and Duke would watch me from the living room window, his expression serious, like he was memorizing my departure in case I didn't come back. I'd come home at 1400, and he'd be waiting at the door, his tail moving in that cautious half-wag. Afternoon in the backyard, throwing the ball, which he'd chase but wouldn't always bring back, like the concept of fetch was something he'd never fully learned. Dinner at 1800. Evening on the porch, me in the old rocking chair my father built, Duke lying at my feet, both of us watching the sun go down behind the pine trees. The hardware store guys noticed the change in me. Dwayne, who managed the electrical aisle, asked one Monday morning if I'd won the lottery. "You seem different, Turner," he said, squinting at me like I'd grown a second head. "More? I don't know. Present, I guess." I shrugged. "Got a dog," I said. He grinned. "That'll do it. Dogs are good for the soul." I didn't tell him that Duke was good for more than my soul, that he was giving me a reason to get up in the morning that didn't feel like a chore, that coming home to someone who was genuinely happy to see me was resetting something in my brain that had been broken for a very long time. The nightmare came on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after I brought Duke home. I was back in country, in the shit, mortars falling like rain, and the smell of cordite so thick you could taste it. We were pinned down in a tree line, and Marcus, always Marcus, was calling for a medic, but I couldn't reach him, couldn't move. My legs were concrete, and the jungle was closing in, and the Huey that was supposed to extract us was burning on the LZ, rotor blades spinning into the dirt, and someone was screaming my name but I couldn't find them in the smoke. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, my heart slamming against my ribs like it was trying to escape. The room was dark, and for a long moment, I didn't know where I was. Vietnam, North Carolina, somewhere in between. My hand fumbled for the lamp on the nightstand, knocked over a glass of water, finally found the switch. Light flooded the room, harsh and immediate, and I was in my bedroom, my safe bedroom with the Braves pennant on the wall, and the old quilt my mother made before she died. And I was 63 years old, not 23, and Vietnam was 40 years ago, not right now. But my body didn't know that. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit on them. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps that didn't seem to pull in enough air. The edges of my vision were getting dark, tunneling, and some distant part of my brain recognized this as a panic attack, something I hadn't had in years, something I thought I'd learned to manage. I heard movement in the hallway, and then Duke was there, standing in the doorway of my bedroom. He'd never come into my room before. Some invisible boundary had kept him in the living room, respecting my space the way I'd respected his. But now he crossed that boundary without hesitation, moving toward the bed with purpose. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He just came straight to me and pushed his head under my hand, forcing contact, his solid warmth anchoring me to the present. I grabbed onto his fur like he was a life raft, my fingers digging into his shoulders, and he stood there and took my weight, took my fear, absorbed it without complaint. "I'm sorry," I gasped, the words coming out broken. I'm sorry. I'm..." Duke shifted his weight and pushed harder against my legs, his presence insistent and grounding. My breathing started to slow. The tunnel vision started to recede. I could feel the texture of his fur under my palms, could hear the sound of his breathing, steady and calm, a counterpoint to my own ragged gasps. 5 minutes passed. 10. Gradually, the panic subsided, leaving me exhausted and hollowed out, but back in my body, back in the room, back in the present. Duke didn't move until my hands stopped shaking. Then he walked around the bed, jumped up, something he'd never done before, and lay down next to me, his back against my side, his head on his paws, his eyes open and watchful. "Thank you," I whispered into the dark, and his ear twitched in response. We stayed like that until morning, both of us awake, both of us keeping watch. Two soldiers who understood that sometimes the real battle is just making it through the night. After that night, something shifted between us. Duke started sleeping in my room, first on the floor next to the bed, then on the bed itself, curled against my back, like he was guarding me from the nightmares that still came, but were less frequent now, less overwhelming. He learned that when I stopped moving in the middle of a task, when I got that faraway look, when I disappeared into a memory, he should press against my leg and bring me back. I learned that when he tensed at sudden noises, I should talk him through it, the same way he talked me through my panic, not with words, but with presence. We learned each other's damage and figured out how to carry it together. The incident at the hardware store happened on a Saturday in December. The store was crowded. Last-minute Christmas shoppers, contractors stocking up before the holidays, the usual weekend rush. I was helping a customer in the plumbing aisle, explaining the difference between PVC and CPVC, when I heard raised voices from the front of the store. I glanced over and saw two men arguing near the register. One of them was Dwayne, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. The other was a customer I didn't recognize, tall, white, maybe 40, with a red face and aggressive body language. "I've been waiting 15 minutes, the man was shouting. "Where the hell is everybody?" Dwayne was trying to de-escalate. "Sir, I apologize for the wait. We're short-staffed today. If you can just give me a moment." "I don't have a moment," the man snapped. "I need to get this pipe fixed before my wife gets home, and I'm not going to stand here while you people jerk me around." You people. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. I excused myself from my customer and started walking toward the front. As I got closer, I could see the situation more clearly. Dwayne, who was black, like me, had his professional mask firmly in place, but I could see the tightness around his eyes, the set of his shoulders. The customer saw me approaching and his expression changed, hardened. "Great. Another one," he muttered. "Let me guess, you're going to tell me to calm down too?" I stopped a few feet away, keeping my voice level. "Sir, I'm happy to help you. What do you need?" He looked me up and down, a quick, dismissive assessment. "I need someone competent," he said. "Is there a manager here? Someone who actually knows what they're doing?" The old anger stirred in my chest. The familiar burn of being judged, dismissed, reduced to something less than human based on nothing but the color of my skin. I'd felt it in the Army when officers looked past me for promotions. I'd felt it in the VA when they questioned whether my PTSD was real. I'd felt it in 1,000 small moments across 6 decades of life in America. But I'd also learned, over years of practice, how to channel that anger into something colder, more controlled. "I've been working in construction and hardware for 30 years, I said quietly. "I'd be happy to help you find what you need. Or if you'd prefer, I can get the store manager. But either way, you're going to need to lower your voice and speak respectfully to my colleague here." The man's face got redder. "I don't need to do anything," he said. "And I sure as hell don't need to take orders from—" He stopped himself, but we all knew what he'd been about to say. Dwayne put his hand on my arm, a gentle warning. "It's okay, Turner. I can handle this." But I was already moving past him toward the customer, not aggressive but deliberate. The man tensed, his hands curling into fists, and I saw the calculation happening in his eyes. The same calculation I'd seen in Rick's eyes at the shelter, in Jennifer's eyes, in the eyes of 1,000 people who looked at me and saw a threat before they saw a person. "Sir," I said, stopping just outside his personal space, "you're welcome to take your business elsewhere if you're not satisfied with our service. But while you're in this store, you will treat the staff with respect. That's not negotiable." For a long moment nobody moved. The store had gone quiet, customers and staff alike frozen, watching to see how this would play out. Then the man grabbed his keys off the counter and headed for the door, muttering something under his breath that included several words I won't repeat. Dwayne let out a long breath. "Thanks, man," he said. "You didn't have to do that." "Yeah, I did," I said, and we both knew what I meant. The store manager, a white guy named Phil who was decent enough but fundamentally didn't understand what it was like to navigate the world in our skin, came out of the back office and asked what happened. Dwayne gave him the abbreviated version, and Phil nodded and said he'd make a note of it. Ban the customer if he came back. It was the right thing to say, but there was a distance in his voice, like this was a problem he could solve with policy rather than something that was bone-deep and systemic and exhausting. I finished my shift, clocked out, and drove home in silence. When I walked through the front door, Duke was there, waiting. He took one look at me, at whatever was written on my face, and pressed against my legs, a solid, grounding presence. I knelt down and wrapped my arms around him, buried my face in his fur, and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back in the store. The anger, the exhaustion, the weight of 63 years of being seen as dangerous before being seen as human. Duke stood perfectly still and let me hold him until the storm passed. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with Duke beside me, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the customer's face, the way he'd looked at me and Dwayne and seen nothing but stereotypes and threats. Thinking about how many times I'd been in that position, how many times I'd had to prove I wasn't what people assumed I was. Thinking about Vietnam, about coming home with a Bronze Star and being called a baby killer by protesters, being refused service at restaurants, being followed by security guards in stores, being pulled over by cops for driving through the wrong neighborhood. Thinking about Marcus, who didn't make it home, who never got the chance to experience decades of casual racism and microaggressions and being seen as less than. Duke shifted beside me, his head coming up, his eyes reflecting the moonlight from the window. He licked my hand once, a gentle, deliberate gesture. "You ever feel like you're fighting a war that never ends?" I asked him quietly. His ear twitched, and I knew that, of course, he understood. He'd been fighting his own war, against fear, against trauma, against the expectation that he would always be dangerous, always be damaged, always be less than. We were the same, he and I. Two veterans of different wars, both carrying scars that no one could see, both trying to figure out how to live in a world that had already decided who we were before we opened our mouths. Christmas came and went. I didn't do much. A small tree in the living room, some lights on the porch, a phone call to my sister in Atlanta who I hadn't seen in 5 years. Duke seemed confused by the tree at first, sniffing it cautiously, but eventually accepted it as a strange new piece of furniture. I bought him a new collar for Christmas, a thick leather one with his name stamped on it, and a bag of expensive treats that the pet store employee promised would make him think I was the best human who ever lived. On Christmas morning, I sat on the floor next to the tree and gave Duke his presents. He sniffed the collar, let me put it on him, then demolished the treats in about 30 seconds. When he was done, he came and sat next to me, his head on my knee, and we stayed like that for a long time, neither of us needing anything more than the other's presence. It was the best Christmas I'd had in decades. In January, I started taking Duke to the VA clinic for my appointments. I'd been going irregularly for years. Checkups, medication refills, the occasional counseling session I'd schedule and then cancel. But Dr. Shapiro, my primary care physician, had been pushing me to come in more regularly, to actually engage with the mental health services, to stop pretending I had everything under control. "You can bring him, doctor," Shapiro said when I mentioned Duke on a phone call about scheduling. "We're a service dog-friendly facility. Might actually help some of the other veterans see that it's okay to need support." So I brought Duke. The VA clinic in Fayetteville was a low, sprawling building that always smelled like floor cleaner and sadness. The waiting room was full of men my age and older, some missing limbs, some with oxygen tanks, all of us carrying the visible and invisible wounds of service. When I walked in with Duke, every head turned. Duke handled it like he'd been doing it his whole life. He walked calmly beside me to the check-in desk, sat when I stopped, didn't react to the other service dogs in the room. The receptionist smiled at him. A real smile, not the professional mask she usually wore, and said, "What a handsome boy." An older vet in a wheelchair rolled over. "Good-looking dog," he said, his voice rough with years of cigarettes. "What's his name?" "Duke," I said. "He an SD?" "No," I said. "Just a good friend." The man nodded knowingly. "Those are the best kind." Dr. Shapiro was impressed when she saw Duke. "He's calm," she noted, watching as Duke lay down next to my chair during the examination. "Does he have training?" "Life training," I said, and she laughed. She asked about my sleep, my nightmares, my anxiety levels. I told her the truth, that they were better since Duke came home, not gone but manageable. She made notes in my chart and renewed my prescriptions, then asked if I'd be willing to talk to someone in the mental health department about getting Duke certified as an emotional support animal. "It's not the same as a service dog," she explained, "but it would give you some protections. Housing, air travel, that kind of thing. And honestly, Mr. Turner, I think you two are doing therapeutic work for each other." I agreed to think about it, which was more than I would have done a year ago. The day everything came full circle was an ordinary Tuesday in March. I was at the hardware store covering the evening shift when a woman came in with a young boy, maybe 10 years old, who was clearly on the spectrum. He was stimming, flapping his hands, making repetitive sounds, and his mother looked exhausted, defeated, like she'd been fighting the world all day. They went to the paint aisle, and I heard the mother trying to get the boy to focus on picking a color for his bedroom. He wasn't interested. He was fixated on the paint mixer, the mechanical sound it made, the way the cans rotated. Other customers were staring, some with annoyance, some with poorly concealed disgust. I saw a man mutter something to his wife and shake his head. The old anger stirred in my chest again, but this time it was mixed with something else: recognition, empathy, the understanding that this mother and son were fighting the same battle Duke and I fought every day, the battle to exist in a world that wanted them to be different than they were. I walked over to the paint aisle, carrying a color sample book. "Hey there," I said to the boy, not too loud, not too intense. "You like the paint mixer?" He didn't look at me, but his mother did, her expression wary, waiting for me to tell them to leave or keep it down or get control of their kid. "It's a pretty cool machine," I continued. "Want to see how it works up close?" The boy's hands stopped flapping. He still wasn't looking at me, but he was listening. "Marcus," his mother said softly, "the man is talking to you." I held up a hand. "It's okay. Marcus, I'm going to mix a can of paint, and you can watch if you want. Your mom can help pick the color." I grabbed a can of primer and put it on the mixer, showed Marcus how the clamps held it in place, how the machine rotated it to blend the pigments. His eyes were locked on the can, his whole body focused. His mother watched, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. When the mixer stopped, I took the can off and handed it to Marcus. "Want to shake it?" I asked. He took it carefully, shook it a few times, and something like a smile crossed his face. His mother mouthed, "Thank you" to me, and I nodded. As they were leaving, she stopped at my register. "That was very kind," she said. "Most people just stare." "I have a friend who people stare at too," I said. "He taught me that kindness is the only thing that matters." That night, driving home, I thought about Duke, about the shelter, about the moment he chose to trust me when every experience in his life had taught him that trust was dangerous. I thought about Marcus and his mother, about the customer who'd called Dwayne and me, "you people," about the vet in the wheelchair at the VA who'd called Duke a good friend. I thought about all the ways we judge each other, all the ways we fail to see the humanity behind the damage, the dignity behind the struggle. When I got home, Duke was waiting at the door, his tail moving in that careful half-wag that had become a full wag somewhere along the way, without me noticing exactly when the transformation happened. I knelt down and he pressed his scarred face against mine, and I realized something I should have understood months ago. I hadn't rescued Duke. We'd rescued each other. The years that followed were quiet ones, in the best sense of the word. Duke and I fell into a rhythm that felt less like routine and more like partnership. We walked every morning before dawn, when the neighborhood was still asleep, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional car on the main road. We worked, him keeping me company while I piddled around the house, fixing things that didn't really need fixing, me taking him to the store on weekends when Phil said it was okay. We existed together in a space that felt safe, maybe for the first time in both our lives. Duke put on weight, his ribs disappearing under healthy muscle, his coat getting shinier. The skittishness faded, replaced by a calm confidence. He still had his triggers, loud noises, sudden movements, men with aggressive body language. But he learned to look to me when he was scared, and I learned to be the steady presence he needed. I got certified as a volunteer at the VA, working with other veterans who were struggling with PTSD, addiction, homelessness. Duke came with me to every session, and I watched him work his magic on men who'd stopped believing that anything good could happen to them. He'd walk up to them slowly, carefully, and rest his head on their knee, the same way he'd done with me in that shelter kennel, and something would break open in their faces. "How do you get him to do that?" one of the counselors asked me after a particularly emotional session where a Gulf War vet had broken down crying with Duke pressed against his legs. "I don't," I said. "He just knows." She nodded. "Trauma recognizes trauma." The nightmares didn't stop completely, but they changed. Instead of drowning in them, I learned to float, to let them wash over me while Duke anchored me to the present. Instead of waking up terrified, I woke up with his weight against my side, his breathing steady, and I could find my way back to myself faster. The panic attacks became rare, then almost non-existent. The world didn't get easier. Racism didn't magically disappear. The VA didn't suddenly become a well-oiled machine. My body didn't stop carrying the weight of age and war. But I learned to navigate it differently, with Duke beside me, both of us understanding that survival isn't about never being afraid. It's about being afraid, and choosing to keep going anyway. I retired from the hardware store at 65. They threw me a small party, cake, handshakes, a gift card to the place I'd been working for 7 years. Dwayne made a speech about what a solid guy I was, and I felt genuinely moved, genuinely seen in a way I hadn't expected. Duke was there, wearing a bow tie that Patricia from the shelter had dropped off as a retirement present, and he accepted pets and praise from all my co-workers with the dignity of a dog who knew his worth. On the drive home, I looked over at Duke in the passenger seat and said, "We did okay, didn't we?" His ear twitched, and his tail thumped once against the seat, and I knew he agreed. We spent my retirement doing simple things. Morning walks got longer. Afternoon naps became a daily ritual. I started volunteering more at the VA, and Duke became something of a celebrity there, the dog who'd chosen a broken veteran and helped him find his way back to something like peace. We took a trip to the mountains one fall, rented a cabin near Asheville, and spent a week doing nothing but hiking and sitting on the porch and existing in the quiet beauty of the world. Duke loved it, the smells, the space, the absence of crowds. On our last night there, we sat on the cabin porch and watched the sun set over the ridges, painting everything gold and red and purple, and I thought about how far we'd both come from that moment in the shelter when two broken souls recognized each other across a chain-link fence. Duke started slowing down when he was around 12, old for a large dog, especially one who'd had a rough start. His muzzle went completely gray, and his hips began to bother him, arthritis setting in the way it had in mine. He couldn't jump on the bed anymore, so I got him a ramp. He couldn't walk as far, so our morning routes got shorter. He slept more, his breathing heavy and labored sometimes, and I'd watch him from my chair and feel my chest tighten with the knowledge of what was coming. Dr. Nguyen at the vet clinic was gentle when she told me that Duke's quality of life was declining. "His heart is working harder than it should," she said, showing me the X-rays, the enlarged chambers, the fluid building up. "We can manage it with medication for a while, but eventually—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I started carrying Duke up the porch steps when he couldn't manage them anymore. I hand-fed him when his appetite waned. I slept on the floor next to his bed when he had bad nights, my hand on his side so he'd know he wasn't alone. Patricia from the shelter stopped by one afternoon with groceries she said she'd accidentally bought too much of. She sat at my kitchen table watching Duke sleep in a patch of sunlight and said quietly, "You gave him the best years of his life, you know. However it ends, he got to know love. That's more than most shelter dogs get." "He gave me something too," I said, my voice rough. "More than he knows." She smiled sadly. "I think he knows." The end came on a Wednesday morning in April. Duke couldn't get up. He tried. I could see him trying, his legs scrabbling for purchase, his eyes apologetic. But his body wouldn't cooperate. I called Dr. Nguyen, and she said she could come to the house, that we could do it here, in his space, with dignity. I said yes because the thought of Duke's last moments being in a sterile clinic was unbearable. She arrived at noon with a young assistant who carried the necessary equipment. I'd spent the morning lying on the floor next to Duke, talking to him, telling him everything I should have said but somehow thought he already knew. "You saved my life," I told him, my hand on his graying muzzle. "I was drowning before you came along, and you pulled me out. You gave me a reason to wake up, a reason to be better, a reason to believe that broken things could still be whole." His eyes, still amber, still clear despite everything else failing, looked at me with complete trust, complete love, and I felt my heart breaking and healing at the same time. Dr. Nguyen was professional and kind. She explained the process, gave me time to say goodbye, then administered the injection that would let Duke go peacefully. I held his head in my lap, my fingers buried in his fur, and I whispered, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," like a prayer, like a mantra, like the only truth that mattered. He took 3 more breaths, each one slower than the last, and then he was gone. The house felt impossibly empty without him. I kept expecting to hear his nails on the hardwood, to see him in his spot by the door, to feel his weight on the bed at night. I kept his collar on my dresser, his bowls in the kitchen, his toys scattered around the living room, because putting them away felt like erasing him, and I wasn't ready for that. The grief was different than other grief I'd experienced, deeper somehow, more childlike. I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a boy, without shame or trying to hold it back, and I let myself feel the full weight of losing someone who'd seen the worst of me and loved me anyway. I'm 68 now, and my hands still shake when it rains. The nightmares still come sometimes, though less frequently, and when they do, I wake up reaching for Duke before I remember. The VA asked if I wanted another dog, said they could connect me with organizations that place service animals with veterans. I said no, Not because Duke was replaceable, but because what we had was specific, a once-in-a-lifetime connection that I wouldn't cheapen by trying to recreate it. I still volunteer at the VA, though, and I tell Duke's story to veterans who are struggling, who don't believe they deserve love or healing or second chances. I tell them about a dog who was hours away from being euthanized, who'd been abused and discarded and written off as too damaged to save, and how he chose to trust one more time when every logical instinct told him not to. I tell them about sitting on a concrete floor crying, and how that broken dog walked toward me instead of away, how he saw my pain and decided it was something he recognized, something he could share. The shelter said he bites strangers, I tell them, and I watch understanding dawn in their eyes. But I wasn't a stranger. I was someone who understood that survival is its own kind of courage. I was someone who knew that being broken doesn't mean being worthless. I was someone who needed saving just as much as he did. Some of them cry, some of them nod. Some of them ask if I think they could find what I found, and I tell them honestly, I don't know, but I know you deserve the chance to try. The lessons Duke taught me weren't complicated. They were simple, fundamental truths that I'd forgotten somewhere between Vietnam and coming home. That dignity matters. That kindness is a choice we make every day. That trauma doesn't have to define us. That love is possible even for things that are damaged. Maybe especially for things that are damaged. He taught me that trust is an act of courage. That being vulnerable isn't weakness. That showing up for someone, consistently, patiently, without judgment, is the most powerful thing you can do. He taught me that we're not defined by the worst thing that happened to us, but by what we choose to do afterward. I think about him every day. When I see someone being dismissed or judged or written off because of their damage, their age, their color, their history. When I hear stories about shelter animals being euthanized because they're unadoptable, known. When I talk to veterans who are convinced they're beyond saving, beyond help, beyond love. I think about amber eyes watching me from the back of a kennel, and a decision made in a moment that changed both our lives. I think about how the woman said, "He bites strangers," and how I wasn't a stranger because pain recognizes pain, and trauma recognizes trauma. And sometimes the most profound connections happen between beings who've both learned that the world can be cruel, but are still, somehow, willing to try again. That's what Duke gave me. Not just companionship, not just therapy, but proof that second chances are real, that healing is possible, that two broken souls can find each other in the wreckage and build something beautiful from the pieces. If you're listening to this and you've got your own scars, your own damage, your own reasons to believe you're beyond saving, I want you to know that Duke's story is your story too. We're all shelter dogs in some way, all waiting in our kennels for someone to see past the warning labels and the bite history and recognize the soul underneath. Some of us are lucky enough to find that someone. Some of us are lucky enough to be that someone for somebody else. Either way, the choice to try, to risk trust, to offer kindness, to show up even when we're scared, that's the choice that saves us. That's the choice that saved me. If this story found you when you needed it, I hope you'll share where you're hearing it from. Sometimes the best way to honor the ones who saved us is to pass their lessons forward, to be for someone else what they were for us. And if you're still looking for your Duke, or still hoping to be someone's Duke, don't give up. The world is full of shelter kennels, and somewhere, someone is crying on a concrete floor, waiting for you to recognize them. Somewhere, someone is watching from the shadows, hoping you'll see past their scars to who they really are. Be brave enough to walk toward them. Be patient enough to let them come to you. Be the person who proves that love is stronger than damage, that connection is possible even in the wreckage, that we're all worth saving, every single one of us, if only someone is willing to see it.